Hello, welcome to another episode of Field of Screams podcast. Today we will be talking about Friday the 13th, the reboot. After Freddy vs. Jason, both franchises laid low for a little bit, until 6 years later, Friday the 13th came out with this reboot. Nightmare on Elm Street then came out with their own reboot 1 year after that. Now in that 6-year wait period, the horror scene had changed. You know, the people that were directing this film, this was no longer going to be wisecracking jokes. This was going to be a lot more darker toned movie. I mean, this was made by the people who made the Texas Chainsaw Massacre reboot. And if you watch that movie's pretty gritty, it's pretty dark. It's a whole different atmosphere compared to Freddy vs. Jason. So that's what kind of movie we get here. So we're going to talk about this movie, and if we're going to talk about it, let's start right from the beginning, right in the get-go, the opening credits. One common question about rebooting the Friday the 13th franchise was, well, how would you do it? You know, do people really want to watch a Pamela Voorhees movie? And I think the overall answer is, no, they don't. And so this movie takes care of it pretty simply. I mean, they literally put Pamela Voorhees right in the opening credits. They have a camp counselor having a final standoff with her that looks... She doesn't look just like Alice, but it's kind of the Alice character. And while they're fighting, you know, Pamela's doing her little spiel about, you should have saved them, you should have did this. And the Alice counselor chops her head off. So there we go, first movie out of the way, and now we can get to the Jason material. I thought it was a very clever way of starting the film. I didn't really want to see Pamela, but the little cameo... Hey, I appreciate it. It's a throwback to the originals. So really good way to start the film, like first 20 seconds. Best move they could have done. They did it. After the opening credits, we then get 5 characters who we assume will be our characters that we will watch throughout the movie. You know, we have our horny couple. We have who we assume is our final girl, along with their typical boyfriend. And then we got kind of this nerdy guy, I think his name was Wade, but they're all stumbling through Camp Crystal Lake, and eventually they decide to camp out in that one spot. They sit around the campfire, they do the old, hey, did you hear the old legend about Pamela Voorhees and her son Jason? And it's a nice throwback to part 2 of Friday the 13th. I mean, this movie's littered with Easter eggs. They did a really good job with that. It's really fun just watching the movie and like, oh, you know, that's kind of a cool tie back. They combined a lot of elements in the early Friday the 13th movies. You know, 1, 2, 3, and even 4. There were just a lot of things from those movies that were thrown into this movie, and it wasn't shoved in your face or over the top, but it's just a nice little cherry on top of whatever's going on in the scene. So after the campfire story, Whitney, who we think is our final girl at the moment, she goes off with her boyfriend, and they kind of just walk around, go exploring. They run into this house, which is Jason's old house that I guess he lived in with Pamela, I think. Or maybe that's the Camp Crystal Lake house. I'm not really sure, but you know it's Jason's, because there's literally a bed in it that says Jason. Also in that house, I mean, this house is just broken down. It's really crappy looking. There's a little hole, and they end up finding Pamela's head in that hole. And it's like a shrine. There's candles everywhere. And again, it's a nice throwback to part 2, the Pamela Voorhees head shrine. Very nicely done. And while they're doing that, we got Wade, who is the nerd in this 5. He's back with the horny couple, and he's trying to like talk to them about different things, but the girl's looking at her boyfriend, and she's like undoing her top, showing her boobs. I think she even puts lotion on her boobs and stuff, like trying to just tempt him to go away with her and make Wade go away, which eventually he's like, dude, you gotta go. And he kind of looks over and sees that her top's off, and he's like, oh, I get it, yeah, I do need to get out of here. Which he does. And that leads to his death. As soon as he gets away, he finds the little weed stash they were looking for. But then when he sees Jason, he's like, no, 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 no. And he's like terrified. It's really good for the first kill, but also when he turns around and sees Jason. Jason's wearing that sack head, which again, throwback to part 2. But when they show him, the sound difference in this movie is crazy because the characters are talking and they're talking really quietly. And then when he turns and sees Jason, there's that loud boom. And it is loud. I actually jumped. I was embarrassed. I've seen this movie before, but whenever that happened, I just bought a new surround sound system, so maybe that's the reason. But I actually jumped in my seat on the very first jump scare. I was like, oh, great. But yeah, he's killed. He's out of the way. Now, what happens next with these characters? The horny couple, they do the deed, but of course they hear something rustling in the bushes. They think it's the nerdy guy. The girl sends the guy out because she's getting creeped out. And I don't think the guy really cares. He even says, like, well, so let him watch. And the girl's just like, that ain't happening. And he even sticks his head out of the tent a few times and he's like, dude, go away. I'm going to kill you. But of course that doesn't work because he's already dead. But eventually he goes out there because she tells him he has to. And when he goes out there, he sees the nerdy guy's severed ear. And then he steps into like a bear trap type device. And he can't get free. Like, he is stuck. And as soon as he gets stuck, Baghead Jason comes through the tent and gets the girl and hangs her up above the campfire. And she starts burning alive inside this tent. It gets very intense very fast. What we thought was our final girl and her boyfriend, they start making their way back, and eventually her boyfriend gets killed. And she comes onto the scene and she sees the one girl's like dead, burnt, singed body, and the other guy, he's still in the trap screaming. She's trying to help him out. Jason sprints over, puts a machete through his head, and then Jason lunges at her. And then you just realize that's the cold open. Like, these characters are not who we're following. This was just the beginning of the movie. It's a good fake out. They spend about 25 minutes. These characters, they're talking. I actually kind of liked them. And if this was your first time watching the movie, you're probably going to get psyched out, especially watching movie after movie of this franchise. Very tricky and a good cold open. I enjoy it. So once we get this nice cold open, we meet the actual characters that we will follow in this movie. They are driving out to a cabin to where they are going on a vacation, and they plan on drinking, they plan on doing drugs, and they plan on doing the deed, just like every other Friday the 13th movie. In this first scene are brand new characters. They go to this gas station. One of the characters, Nolan, he starts pumping gas. Character Trent, who I kind of took notes over this movie to kind of help me remember the names and what the character represents. And for Trent, right in the beginning of the movie, I just wrote down douche. I think that's a good word to describe his character. I mean, that is the purpose of his character. He is the boyfriend to Jenna, who now looks like our brand new final girl. But yeah, not a very nice guy. And the way they do this is when they're in the gas station, we have a character named Clay, who is not part of the group. He's honestly just looking for his sister, who is Whitney, who is the first girl in the cold act that we see Jason lunge at. Clay is looking for his sister, which is a borrowed plot line from Friday the 13th, Part 4. Again, another nice throwback. In Part 4, the brother's looking for his sister that died in Part 2. He was looking for whatever happened so he could get revenge, and Clay's kind of on the same path. But when we meet Clay, Clay is a very nice guy. He is very calmly asking for directions, and Trent's just like, hey dude, you've been yapping for a while. You want to move out of the way so we can pay for our drinks? And Clay's just kind of like, yeah, sure, dude, whatever. Steps aside, and then Trent looks over and he's like, what? We still cool? We gonna be best buds now? We gonna hang out later or what? And Clay's like, really? You're gonna do this? And just their back and forth is just very bro-y and very 2000s-ish. But yeah, as soon as this conversation happens, it makes you kind of just go like, I don't really like Trent. Once we get back to the house where they're staying at, the main characters, we kind of find out who the other characters are a little bit. Some of them are very one-dimensional. We have Lawrence and Chewie, who are the typical stoners. That's basically just their role. They smoke, they drink, they're goofy. There's a moment where Chewie goes out to the shed, and he's mad at Trent because Trent, this is literally his house, and this entire trip, Trent is just like yelling at the entire group, like, "Hey, easy on the floors. These are oak. Like, you can't be stepping on them hard." And they'll play a game, and he's like, "Oh, guys, this is an outside game. Why are we doing this inside?" And like, Trent is just super stressed out this entire movie about making sure this house does not get ruined during this party. And during this little gimmick, I actually kind of started to like Trent a little more, just because of this whole gimmick of him yelling at everyone, telling everyone to calm down, not to make messes, don't spill this, you broke my favorite chair. I thought it was kind of funny as it got going. So I don't know if I'd call it redemption, but it made me like Trent a little more. And there's a scene with another girl character, Bree, later on that is pretty funny in itself. I mean, it's not good dialogue, but it's cringy enough. It makes me laugh. It's whatever. But yeah, Lawrence, he goes out to the shed, and the shed is ginormous. Lawrence is immediately mad, saying they're rich. He's like, "I'm going to drink all this alcohol in this cabinet." He finds a hockey stick, starts acting like a hockey player, and then takes the wildest swing ever and blows out an entire light. And once he does this, of course, Jason's standing right behind him. And he ends up killing Chewie right then and there. And Lawrence's demise, basically he's worried about Chewie, and these guys are best bros. And Lawrence risks it all by going out there with a pan. And Jason like throws an axe like 30 feet, going right into him. And he leaves them out there screaming, hoping the others come out, which Clay eventually meets up with them. He's like, "Hey, don't go out there." And Jason realizes this, so he just finishes him off. So that's the end of the stoners in the group. Now I jumped ahead a bit. I guess I should have technically started with the characters Nolan and Chelsea, because they're not around for very long. But Nolan basically signals to Trent that him and Chelsea are going to get it on and that they need to go away from the group. Trent tries to be a bro and lets him have his truck and says, "Yeah, my boat's out there. You guys can go out on the boat." But then Trent pulls Nolan to the side and was like, "Listen, don't drive the boat. Only I drive the boat." And Nolan is just like, "Aye, aye, Captain." And that makes Trent happy. But then once they're driving in the truck, like, Nolan's flying down the road, the truck's going airborne, like they're part of the Dukes of Hazzard. And like, he's literally just monologuing. He's like, "Huh, as soon as he said not to drive the boat, you knew I was going to drive this boat." And I'm like, why is he evil monologuing? But the very first note I put down for Nolan, I put a rich man's Owen Wilson, which if you're watching this movie, he does look like Owen Wilson quite a bit. Chelsea's his girlfriend. She's kind of just in the truck, like laughing along at his evil monologue. And she's like, "I think that's hot." But eventually she goes jet skiing while Nolan is driving the boat, despite Trent saying not to. Chelsea is topless during this scene. She's very good at skiing. Until Nolan gets shot in the head with a bow arrow. Now, they're so far out in the lake. I don't know how Jason hits him. I don't know how Jason gets the arrow in the boat, let alone direct shot in the head. I guess Jason's been living in the woods for a very long time, and he knows how to live off the land, and he knows how to shoot things, but man, this was a far shot. But he got Nolan. And the next bit's actually kind of cool. Chelsea's waiting for Nolan to come back with the boat, and of course Nolan's dead, so the boat's just going out of control. Chelsea doesn't know that, and the boat smacks her hard, and she's bleeding in the head. And there's a very cool shot when she looks over. Jason's just standing at the bank, just waiting for her to come to shore, which she smartly doesn't. She hides under a pier, and then Jason just very quickly stabs her in the head and pulls her up. And when he pulls her up, we get the two things that we usually see in Friday the 13th movies, blood and boobs. And that's what we get. And that's the end of Chelsea and Nolan. In the beginning of this movie, Clay bounces around from house to house looking for his sister. And eventually he does stumble upon a guy. He's a redneck. That's basically his character, named Donnie. Donnie's very weird. He's like messing with the wood chipper. He yells at Clay because Clay's like, "Hey, excuse me." And of course Donnie doesn't hear him, so Clay walks up behind him, scares Donnie. Donnie's like drinking beer while chewing tobacco while smoking a cigarette. Donnie's like, "Oh, you're lucky I didn't beat you." And basically tells Clay to get going, but then he makes him stop and goes, "Wait, by the way, would you like some weed?" And of course Clay, because Clay's a good guy in the movie, he's like, "Oh, no thank you." And Donnie's like, "You sure? I have a ton of it." And it's just a weird exchange in this movie. I'm guessing Donnie's supposed to be one of the weird side characters, because even later, when he goes up into his little barn or whatever you want to call it, he stumbles upon a mannequin, and he starts monologuing about how he lost his virginity to this mannequin. Again, weird side character. But when Jason kills him, this is actually the transition from Baghead Jason to Hockey Mask Jason. So we get the nice throwback from part 2 transitioning into part 3. Again, this movie does a very good job with all the Easter eggs and all the stuff with the older movies. And eventually, Clay makes his way back to our original characters. And when he knocks on the door, what we assume is our new final girl, Jenna. I believe Jenna's her name. Yeah, it's Jenna. Jenna answers the door. She invites him in. Clay knows it's a bad idea. He's like, I don't know. And Jenna's like, "Oh no, it'll be fine. We can all party." And then as soon as he gets in, Trent throws a fit, tells him to get out. "This is my house." And kicks Clay out. And Clay's just like, "Alright, whatever. I kind of expected this." But of course Clay's a good guy, so he just looks at Jenna. He's like, "It is his house." And Jenna's like, "Well, I'll look around with you for a little bit." And Jenna and Clay, they walk out during daylight. When they come back into the house, it's got to be past midnight. It's completely dark outside. She walks around with them for a very long time. Now, while they are walking, they do stumble upon a very important plot point, a thing that a lot of people like, and it is kind of cool. It's Jason's underground tunnels, which we eventually find out Whitney, who was in that first cold open, is still down there because she looks like Jason's mom. And that's kind of revealed during the cold open. They find that little picture, and her boyfriend at the time was like, "Hey, she looks just like you." That's why Jason keeps her alive in these tunnels. Now, these tunnels, there's little tripwires out in the woods, and whenever a character would hit them, it would ring bells in the tunnel, so Jason would know where these characters are, and these tunnels are also an explanation of why Jason can get around so quickly. Now, if you remember back in the old movies, Jason sometimes would teleport to very high obstacles. So these tunnels do not answer those moments. In part 4, when he's downstairs killing someone, and then all of a sudden he appears upstairs and kills someone, and then all of a sudden he's outside. Those tunnels don't explain that. And there's even a part in this movie where he kills someone outside, and then it does a quick cut, and then he's on top of the house. Tunnels can't do that. But it is a nice attempt at an explanation of how Jason can sometimes teleport. Now, we do need to talk about another character named Bree. Bree in this group is the hot girl. That's what I would say to describe her. There's a scene to where she is dancing with a bottle of wine. All the camera angles are correct, and this dance is very, very close to the dance scene that is in Cabin in the Woods. Both of them are blonde girls. Both of them are dancing with bottles, if I'm correct. I know as I was watching it, I'm like, I wonder if Cabin in the Woods was looking at this scene directly whenever they filmed their scene. I'm not sure. I don't know the dates off the top of my head, but it wouldn't surprise me. And I mean, I think it was Chewie even said, like, hey, we're all here just to do one big cliche dance, right? Or it was something like that. So they knew what they were doing, making this scene. They're like, how do we get out there that Bree's supposed to be the hot girl? Let's have her do a dance. And that's how it happens. Because right after this dance, Trent gets all mad at Chewie because he broke a chair. And Bree's like, hey, come on, I know what can calm you down. And she takes him into a bedroom and they do the deed. Now, when they do the deed, Trent has some lines that are just awful. While they are doing it, Trent looks up at her and says, your tits are stupendous. And then a little bit later, he goes, oh, your tits are just so juicy. And then I think he even says they are perfectly aligned. Very goofy and funny dialogue. And at the end of the scene, I think Bree even makes a joke and Trent's like, oh, that was, and he trails off and Bree's kind of just like stupendous. And he just kind of laughs and he's like, oh, yeah, it was. Again, as the movie got going, I kind of like Trent just because he was so out there as the mean character. Now what got me is eventually Jenna gets back with Clay, and they're freaked out because they know Jason's a legit thing. They've seen the bodies. Chewie and Lawrence are practically dead already. And while this is going on, Trent and Bree are, still doing the deed. Jenna goes outside the door and is pounding on the door, telling him to get outside the room. And Trent is literally just going, we're busy. And there's like not one line of dialogue that shows that Jenna is frustrated that he is with Bree, or that Trent is worried because he's caught with Bree while Jenna's right outside the door. It isn't acknowledged. I'm really not sure why, but then eventually Trent gets outside the door, sees Clay, and he's like, are you serious? Have you been walking around with him this entire time? How could you? And it's right when he leaves the room after the Bree scene. So, yeah, that happened. But I guess Jenna doesn't have to worry very long, because Jason does impale Bree with deer antlers that are hanging on the wall, like the little mantle. It's a nice little kill. He impales her, and then basically it comes down to Clay and Jenna and Trent. It gets down to those three. They get on the run, and Trent gets separated from the group, and in the back of your mind, you're like, okay, Trent's kill is going to be pretty good, because he is very hateable. Like, they're not going to do his death easy. So Trent runs across the highway and almost gets blasted by a truck. And when that happens, he kind of pauses and looks at the truck, and you can't see the driver. And the driver kind of waves for him to, come here. But Trent is very hesitant, which I don't blame him. And he walks up slowly, and all of a sudden in the truck, an old man pops his head out with, tubes in his nose, I think. It almost looked like he was on oxygen. So Trent realizes that Jason is not driving that truck. And when he turns around, Jason is indeed right behind him. To which Jason then stabs him and then impales him on it like a spike that collects bales of hay. And the truck driver, seeing this, freaks out and floors the truck. So the truck's speeding off while Trent's body's being dragged while he's being impaled. So Trent gets his due death, as we all probably expected. So now we get down to Clay and Jenna, who it's looking like they might have been our two main characters that might live in this movie. But then they get into the tunnel. And when they get into the tunnel, which, by the way, on their way in the tunnel, there is a wheelchair that is a nod to, I forget what the character's name, but it's the wheelchair character in part 2. Again, nice throwback. But they see Whitney down there and they break her free. And when they do this, like, in my head, I'm kind of like, okay, they're probably not going to have 2 final girls. So, who's it going to be? Or will it be a final 3? You'll never know. But then you find out pretty quickly, because as they're escaping the tunnel, Jason stabs Jenna, which I think that is a very surprising kill, because Jenna has final girl written all over her. She is a very innocent character. She was very nice to Clay. She had to endure dating Trent and all the tragedies that line up with that. So when she's stabbed and killed, it is a surprise. And then we get to our final 2 characters. We have Whitney and we have Clay. After a bit of running around, eventually we get into our final fight. And Clay and Jason actually go at it toe to toe. It's a pretty even fight. But then Jason turns on this like wood chipper meat grinder type machine. I don't know. I'm not a farmer. I'm not very handy with that stuff. But he turns it on and he almost puts Clay's head through it until Whitney steps up and she's like, Jason. And it's a nice callback to part 2. Jason turns around thinking it's his mom, and that gives him enough time to get a chain around his neck, and it pulls him near that little grinder, and then Whitney gets like one final line in. I think she says, say hi to mommy in hell, stabs him, he falls back, and the grinder like grinds the back of his head, and that's the death of Jason. Human Jason, human, deformed, living on the land Jason. That's the death of him. Or is it? Because then we see the final 2 characters. They throw the body in the lake. They throw the mask in the lake. They throw that little locket of his mom in the lake. But then, of course, they do the nod to the first 4 movies where there's that jump scare to end it all. Of course, they went there. They had to do it. As you're watching the scene, you're like, oh, Jason's going to pop up. And of course, he goes through the pier and he grabs Whitney. And that's the end of the movie. So my final thoughts on this movie. It was a lot smarter than I remembered it being. And if you thought the old movies were way too slow, this movie is a lot faster paced. There's, a lot of Easter eggs that are thrown back from the first 4 movies. There's shots that are identical from those movies. It pays a lot of homage, is that the word? Or homage. It knows what it is. It knows what it has to be. It's a very 2000s type movie. I enjoyed it a lot. I was never bored during this movie. There's parts where I cracked up. One more shout out that I forgot to mention. When Bree is indeed impaled, Trent goes out to his car and Jason throws Bree's body on top of his car and he lets out this girliest scream ever. I cracked up at that scene. I thought it was hilarious. It was great coming from Trent. The movie had some parts that made you giggle or laugh, and it's kind of a dark-toned movie, and I thought they did a really good job. It's kind of a shame that we haven't gotten a Friday the 13th movie ever since. They need to get on it because this reboot wasn't that bad. It was pretty good. And it would have been nice to get a sequel and maybe see Zombie Jason. But who knows now, because it's been so long since they've even done that. So they would probably have to reboot it again. I don't know. But if you're still listening, I appreciate you guys listening. A lot of you guys are commenting, giving feedback what you think, and that's awesome. I love hearing that stuff. And I really appreciate you guys, those who have subscribed and have joined me along this Friday the 13th adventure. I do want to keep doing these big franchises because they are fun to marathon and look at all these movies back to back to back. It was cool doing that with this franchise, and I want to do that with others. I want to do Halloween soon. I will say that. If you enjoyed this episode, give it a like. That helps out the channel. And if you want to listen to future episodes, go ahead and hit that subscribe and maybe that little bell button. So it will let you know. Once again, thanks guys, and until next time.